Good evening, and thank you for joining us for tonight's program, Coffee and Politics with Congressman Don Beyer, presented by American Public Square at Jewell Student Initiative. I'm thrilled to be coming to you from our office space here in PlexPod in Westport for tonight's segment of Coffee and Politics. My name is Allison Koelzer, and I'm the Student Initiative Coordinator at American Public Square and the producer of our podcast, Both Sides. I'm honored that we have the opportunity this evening to showcase work done by our Student Planning Committee and by our APS Spring Intern Team as a part of Student Month at APS. I would like to take a moment to express our gratitude to the funders of the APS Student Initiative, including the Sherman Family Foundation, the McDonald Foundation, and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. I would also like to take a moment to thank our program and presenting sponsors for tonight's program. Marnie and John Sherman, the Hall Family Foundation, the H&R Block Foundation, Sue Seidler and Louis Nerman, PlexPod, and William Jewell College. Tonight's event is the first in a series of 4 programs in Student Month at APS. For more details about Student Month, please visit our website at www.americanpublicsquare.org/events. We're thrilled to be kicking off this month of student planned programs with tonight's look at student loan debt, higher ed reform, and student loan forgiveness from a legislator's perspective. We are honored to be joined by Congressman Don Beyer for a conversation with myself and the founder of American Public Square at Jewell and the co-host of our podcast, Both Sides, Allan Katz. As always, during American Public Square programming, we welcome questions from the audience. I'll be watching for those questions that you might have for Congressman Beyer. Please feel free to type those into the Q&A section of Zoom or on the Facebook live stream. With that, I would like to welcome Congressman Don Beyer to the program. Congressman Beyer is serving his 4th term as the U.S. Representative from Virginia's 8th District, representing Arlington, Alexandria, Falls Church, and parts of Fairfax County. He serves on the House Committees on Ways and Means, Science, Space, and Technology, and is the chair of the Joint Committee on Economics. Prior to serving in Congress, Beyer served as the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia from 1990 to 1998 and was the ambassador to Switzerland and Liechtenstein under President Obama. Welcome, Congressman Beyer. And Allan, let me send it over to you to ask the first question.
Well, thank you very much. And Congressman, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We made a slight modification. This is normally known as Cocktails and Politics, but because this is Student Month, and we didn't want to sort of send them wrong message, we decided to sort of make it Coffee and Politics, and we hope that you'll indulge us and you'll come back sometime and we'll do Cocktails and Politics. Let me sort of start this off. The whole issue of student debt is one that obviously has 2 very different points of view. I'd be interested if you could give us sort of an overview from your perspective. How would you characterize the 2 sides, and sort of where do you think we ought to be going with this?
Well, first of all, I'm thrilled to be invited to be part of this, Allan. Allison, I got to know Allan Katz when we were both first-term ambassadors in Obama. And I got to slum in Switzerland because Allan got to go to Portugal, and it was very cool. We were among the most privileged, lucky people in the world to be able to serve our country and to do it in a glorious time when Barack Obama was trying to bring the world together. And it was wonderful fun. And I'm so glad that, most ambassadors, after they leave, they spend the rest of their lives wandering around trying to figure out what to do next. And Allan and I both landed on our feet. And his American Public Square initiative is something that I really am impressed by, and I hope that we can recreate in the eastern part of the United States. So Allan, to your question, I was flattered to be invited tonight because this is a really hard issue. On the one hand, college kids are carrying more debt than ever before. Well, I went to a 4-year college at $4,000 a year, tuition, room, and board, which I could actually afford, and emerged with no college debt, and my wife with no college debt, and therefore was able to buy a car right out of college and buy a house a couple of years later. And I had no debts to pay, and I got to be entrepreneurial early. Right now, it's much, much harder for these kids to do any of those things. And it's no surprise that, I'm surrounded by all these wonderful young people in Congress, none of whom are married, because they don't marry until their mid-30s. And part of that is driven by the college debt. And so there's a real, and the state commitments to tuition reduction have really fallen off. In University of Virginia, which we like to call a public Ivy, because it's got this, great education. And when I was a kid, 80% of the tuition was funded by the state government. Now it's like 8%. So they went from being publicly funded university to a publicly supported university to now we call it a public head fake university. There's a little bit of a like glancing blow. But on the other side, to move quickly ahead, when people get a college degree, their lifetime earnings are much greater than those that don't have a lifetime degree. So maybe it is worth something. And a significant part of the debt, I think like 2/3, is held by people, med school or law school or graduate school. So people who are going to make a lot more money than the median income. So do we really want to be making it free for those? And that gets sort of I was talking about this with my 25-year-old daughter, who fortunately had no college debt. And she said, if you're going to do like Elizabeth Warren and give $50,000 to all these kids who just graduated from college, or $10,000 like Joe Biden says, what do you do with the poor kid that decided he couldn't afford to go to college? They get nothing. Where's my $10,000? Where's my $50,000? Or what about the parents who scraped and saved all those years to be able to put their child through University of Missouri, Kansas City, and without any debt at all, and then find out that Joe Biden's given all those other kids $10,000 or Elizabeth Warren's given them $50,000. Where's the fairness in all that? So it's a difficult issue, and I'm eager to see you cut the baby in half, Allan.
Well, the question would be, one response to your daughter's query, of course, is that life is unfair, and the reality is that at any point in time, there are people who have paid a price that's not going to be repaid, but that doesn't mean that everyone else should have to suffer along the way. If something is done to deal with the existing level of student debt, do you think it should be based on need, or do you think there should be special circumstances for minorities who clearly bear an unfair burden because of the lack of opportunity, or women, or do you think that it ought to just be sort of what it is for everybody and then we move on?
Oh, I confess my progressive instincts are coming out. I very much think it should be based on need. Once again, if you look at the kids who go to Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Brown, Penn, et cetera, not all of them, but many of them come from pretty wealthy families. Many of them are legacies and their parents did really well. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense to be bailing them out. On the other hand, my Joint Economic Committee, which we talked a little bit about, did a report about 2 weeks ago on the impact of student debt on Black college students. They get more debt, they're more likely to be in trouble with the debt, more likely to have defaults. It's a much greater percentage of their net worth. And it ends up being a much greater burden on them, or barrier to things like home ownership, car ownership, entrepreneurialism. When you're looking at a big monthly nut, it's a lot easier to go to work for a corporation with a secure paycheck than it is to go take risks out in the real world. So I very much think you need to titrate it based on need. And also, even more importantly, I think to think structurally, which we should talk about some later.
Yeah, and so Don, what did you say about when you look at the need base for those groups that we know? Studies have shown that women and students of color, specifically women of color, have the most student loan debt in the country per group. What kinds of solutions are you hearing about in your caucuses and whatnot related to those need-focused strategies?
Well, let's talk about the low-hanging fruit. The easiest one is just increasing the number and the amount of the Pell Grants, because they're good. They're a wonderful thing. They help people, who can't afford it to be able to afford it better. But as the cost of college goes up triple the rate of the consumer price index, there's a lot more adaptation needed there. A second thing is being able to refinance student debt. One of my youngest best friends had parents with bad credit. And she wanted to go to the University of Pittsburgh. And my wife and I caved and just agreed to co-sign on her student loans for 4 years. And the first year was 6%, the second was 7%, then 8%, fourth year was 9%. I called up and said, wait a minute, I'm signed on this loan. You know, I don't have 9% credit rating. And they said, we don't care about you, we care about her. And so one of the Biden ideas, for example, is that if the federal government is to step in, it should make student loan interest zero. You should basically subsidize whatever is there. And that would dramatically bring down the cost. As Albert Einstein said, you know, one of the secrets of the universe is compound interest. That's okay if you're earning it, but if you're paying it, it's pretty painful.
So let me ask this, Don. Do you see something being done about the student debt situation in any of the larger infrastructure type bills that are being bandied about right now?
Alan, it's certainly possible. They're certainly not baked. Lots and lots of moving pieces. Nancy Pelosi, our speaker, hopes to put the infrastructure bills on the floor of the House by 4th of July. But the cynics among us think it will be Christmas or Hanukkah before we actually get a final vote passed, because there are going to be so many moving pieces. So plausible. I think perhaps more credible is apparently US law gives the president the ability to waive some of this debt. And our current president asked the Secretary of Education, Cardona, to look at how much he could do legally, you know, without having it, you know, overturned by the courts. So, you know, I think, you know, I'm often wrong, but if I had to put guess in an envelope, I'd say Joe Biden would forgive 10,000 and it wouldn't show up in the infrastructure bills at all.
Okay.
And if anything shows up, it would be much more money to state and local governments specifically tied to higher education. Because one of the movements that is going to help is the free community college. And this is, you come at it from the side that very few jobs are high school only, but also not every job needs to be college, a 4-year degree. You know, the 4-year degrees in so many instances are just the ticket, look, I'm smart, and I can work hard, and I'm responsible, not what you learn. So if we can turn out people with 2-year degrees that give them the skills they need to do AI or cybersecurity or whatever, great. And those states like New York and Tennessee and increasingly Virginia that have made those first 2 years free, I mean, that pulls down the burden of student loans in the 3rd and 4th year, if they go on.
Do you have any idea what something like that would cost if we did it nationally?
I don't. I don't have my numbers wrapped around it, although you are seeing a number of states, I can't tell you off the top of my head how many, but my sense is like more than a dozen are moving in this direction, committed to it, that states have figured out how to do it. Mm-hmm. And, you know, and sometimes it's in painful ways, with adjunct professors that don't get paid very much and things like that, but it still moves it, right? And you're not dealing with room and board and dormitories, and as we've seen, I think the average age of a community college student in Virginia is 25. So, and they tend to be really good students because they're also working and often taking care of children.
So if you were talking to a student who had, and I'm going to make this up, let's say $100,000 worth of student debt, which unfortunately is not that unusual, and they come out of a 4-year college, and maybe they went and got a master's degree, and they have a master's in English, and so they're going to be a school teacher, which we need desperately, and we need good teachers. And if he looked up and he said, is the government going to help me? What kind of answer would you give him today?
I would say that my guess is that the government will help you some. Mm-hmm. That it seems pretty unlikely that the government is going to step in and relieve the bigger debts. And the bigger debts are law school and med school,
Right.
and some graduate school, but so many of the people that are pursuing graduate degrees, certainly in the sciences, engineering, are largely paid for by the universities.
Right.
I have my future son-in-law's brother had people competing to give him money to come get his physics PhD.
Right. Right.
And on the English major, the English graduate that graduates with a master's degree in English and owes $100,000, I'd have to really have a really serious conversation about their financial planning, just in general.
Well, no, I think that's right. Alice, you got a question?
Yeah, for sure. I'm thinking a lot of different things here. I wanted to mention first, I went to a community college. I appreciate your shout out that we are very hardworking. I did work all throughout my first couple years there. And I actually think that brings up a really interesting point about adjunct professors and the intersection of student loan debt, forgiveness for professors. And I'm curious about some of your thoughts and how you might possibly see this or not as a bipartisan in a way for the different parties to come together about this, because we already have quite a few programs that exist that recognize public service, teaching, and otherwise. If you follow a certain path, then you can get your loans forgiven, right? There are a lot of issues with those programs. We know that. Is the idea of bolstering and helping someone who decides to teach at a community college, do you think there's a path for bipartisan support for something like that? Or is that still too progressive for some of your conservative colleagues?
No, I think that is a really good bipartisan way. I have a friend who is a member of the Alaska legislature and lives on the little Sitka Island. I said, how in God's name did you get to Sitka Island? He said his mother graduated from Yale Medical School, and they said they'd pay off her med school debt if she went to Sitka and practiced medicine. And they loved it and stayed.
Right.
So I think that, and one of the things that this administration has done is tried to do expanding student loan forgiveness for public sector workers. And Allan, one of the things you may know is these young people who work on the Hill for us, my staff, all have some contribution to their student loan debt every month. And so I hate it when their student loan gets paid off because they all quit, you know. But it's an attraction, and it's maybe one reason why people accept lower wage jobs to do that. By the way, this ties into another really important idea. I've been a fan, as I'm sure Ambassador Katz has too for years, of the notion of universal public service for young people, 18, 19, 20-year-olds. I'm still upset that they did away with the draft because it ended up being America's the melding pot. You know, you really mix all kinds of wonderful people together. And General Stan McChrystal, who is, you know, I think a really wonderful man, has been working for a couple of years on the legislation, the project on universal public service for the 18, 19-year-olds. And the trade-off is free tuition. You know, they're contributing to the society in many, many different ways, and building our culture and building the sense of community that they're going to give back for the rest of their lives. And then we're also going to make sure that they have no college debt for a couple of years.
Yeah, I think that there's a strong argument that 18 is probably a little young to be heading off to college and really taking advantage of the situation. I know, for example, in Israel, that's when you get to go to the army for 2 years, whether you want to or not. That's sort of part of the deal. I think that the idea of Peace Corps, Vista, any of the kind of, there's a whole slew of different programs people could do. And I think there's a trade-off for free college. Allison, do you think we'd attract a lot of young people to do that?
I don't know. I don't want to speak on behalf of all young people, but I would have been very interested in that because I was going to work really hard no matter what, whether it was at a coffee shop or not. And my values would have been very much aligned with the opportunity to serve my country for a couple years and not have any debt. I mean, I'm like, sign me up, right? But I don't know that that's the case for everyone, especially for, I would say I have some friends who would lean a little bit more left than I do and would say, no, you know what, like this, I'm bettering myself. I want to better myself. I shouldn't have to do anything to do that. And I should be able to do it in a smart way. Maybe I don't need to have it completely paid for me, but I at least don't want to be crippled to the point that I can't buy a car right out of school and I can't live on my own and work my way up in my own career without feeling just completely apprehended by the $500, $600 amount that they owe every month, which is the reality for some people. I'm fortunate to not have that reality. But it is an interesting question. It's one that I'm certainly going to ask some of my friends about. My younger brother, who will go to college next year, to see what he would think about that. That'll be interesting to ask him.
Yeah, Allison, there's an interesting middle ground too. Washington Post made this argument a couple of years ago that, 1 out of 6 applicants for Teach for America is accepted. 1 out of 5 applicants for the Peace Corps is accepted. AmeriCorps is like 1 in 3. So you have many more young people who want to do these things than we have structured to set up and pay for them. And if we don't want to go with universal service for every 18, 19-year-old, just do universal service for every 18, 19-year-old that wants to do it. And that will be an explosion, it'll be 5 times or more what we have right now. So it's not the whole solution, but, moves us in the right direction.
Yeah, actually, but yeah, it's interesting, Don. My son did Teach for America. And when he told me he'd been admitted, this was a number of years ago, I had no idea how competitive it was. So I turned to my wife afterward. I said, maybe he's smarter than we think. But I think that what happens is that, so at this stage of the game, though, the other piece I think that we need to we haven't talked about very much is a lot of the student debt that grew out of the types of schools that really are not providing what they're telling people they're providing, some of which lost their accreditation along the way. That's one of the stories in the Post today. How much of that, is there anything that can be done about that? Because I also know there are schools that do a very good job, even if they're a for-profit school, and basically they're placing most of their graduates and they're training them in unique ways. But we know that the situation that we're facing, a lot of people are facing, are based on unfulfilled promises.
Yeah, it's again, the pendulum has swung a couple of different ways on that. In the Obama administration, they really cracked down on the for-profit colleges, many of which they thought had fraudulent advertising regimes and really fairly rarely turned out outcomes that matched what the kids were paying for. And then you got Betsy DeVos, who swung the whole way. Her family fortune was in these private schools, and they got away with murder for 4 years. We're likely to have it swing back. But I hope that it swings back in a way that recognizes that that there are kids, young people who come out of these private schools, private for-profit, with really good skill sets. I've got a bunch of auto mechanics who trained at Universal and a few other of these schools who, are wonderful technicians, and they're making really good money now because they invested in it. We just have to catch the ones that are borrowing money from the government to not teach kids anything useful.
And borrowing the max amount. That's one red flag. I've been talking with an academic advisor that's joining us at a program on Thursday. He'll be a panelist speaking about proprietary institutions and how the student borrower should have a red flag that goes up if they're being asked to take out literally the max amount that they're able to take out each year through loans, that should be something that they reflect on and that they aren't just signing away. So it's intersecting, the idea of more regulation for these institutions, but also how can we educate the student themselves and to have advice for them so that they know what they're signing on to, that this school might not be, promising the big shiny career, the degree that they want afterwards. I think it's the same thing too, like you were mentioning with some technical schools. My sister actually attended a massage therapy program, and it was really great for her, but it did come with a price tag that she's now decided to go elsewhere and study elsewhere. And now that's become an issue for her, that she has this existing loan, an extremely high amount for a 1-year program to get a certificate, not a degree. And now she's faced with wanting to get that actual degree from a 4-year nonprofit institution, and now having to grapple with that others. So I think it's twofold for me for the solutions there. I would like to see more regulation for the proprietary institutions, but also to have more advice and counsel for students who are thinking about these different huge life choices.
Yeah, my wife was on the board of the Virginia community college system for a bunch of years and can make a very eloquent argument about how much better a deal community colleges are than the for-profit, just because of the difference in the nature of the service. But another thing that we haven't talked about at all is structurally, why have colleges became so crazy expensive? You know, to go to so many schools in the East, it's $60,000, $70,000 a year, right. Tuition, room, and board. It's insane. And you look and say, and I don't have the solutions, but you know, a lot of it is administration. Some of his colleges competing against each other, you know, who has the biggest gym or the best basketball team, or, and then I'm not a professor, so I don't want to insult Professor Katz over there, but you know, professors who teach versus professors who do research. Mm-hmm. You do need those that have tenure and can do the research, because we want to be pushing forward, but at the same time, you know, who's doing the teaching? No. I'm way far away from an expert, but there have to be some experts who come and say, there's a way to rationalize the expense structure of colleges that maximizes what kids learn and minimizes the overall cost. And that's not the way it's grown. In fact, my friends on the right would make the case, which I don't necessarily buy, but it's interesting to hear, that the explosion in the cost of college has coincided and even been caused by the availability of federal student loan debt. When they can borrow, then the colleges can say, hey, you can borrow, we'll raise the price.
Well, you know, it's an interesting thing. There's a book, I don't know whether you've read it or not, by Dr. Sandel from Harvard, called The Tyranny of Merit. And it's a fascinating book. And really the notion, I mean, I must confess that I have less sympathy for the kids that wind up going to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, walking away with a lot of debt, because, as you pointed out, either they come from families with money, or more importantly, they're likely, the world opens up many more opportunities to them.
Absolutely.
Than for other folks, you know. But I think that the other question is, do you see the government, outside of the increase in the amount of Pell Grants, so that they sort of are indexed to what college costs these days, are there other ways, are there other programs that you see there that could be provide students with a way of not walking away with the crippling debt, and whether it's like you suggested in terms of teaching in the community, or Allison did, or as you pointed out with doctors, for a long time, rural community going to, I think there was some sort of a federal program that if you went to a rural community as a doctor for 2 years, part of your debt was eliminated by the government. But
I think some of those still exist. At least I hope they still do.
You know, I mean, is this something that could be because there are two pieces. There's the people right now with the, what is it, the $1.7 trillion in debt or whatever, some ridiculous number is like that. And the question is, what about tomorrow? Okay, I mean, those people we have to deal with, you know, or not, as the case may be. But going forward, do we need to sort of replicate that structure that we know doesn't work? What can we do really to kind of keep that from happening?
Well, here's another interesting piece of this argument. If you jump back 40 years, go to 1980 or even 1990, you go to 1980 and look at the percentage of the American population that was incarcerated, or the number of Americans that were incarcerated before the war on drugs, and look at it now with 2.2 million, the greatest number and the greatest percentage of the population of any country in the world. That's all the money that we used to spend on universities that we're now spending on prisons. If you cut the prison population in half and take those same dollars and invest it in higher education, you get much, much better. You know, another way to look at it, Allan and Allison, one of the coolest parts about being a member of Congress is I get to nominate people to the military academies, West Point, Annapolis, Colorado Springs, and the Merchant Marine. Mm-hmm. And we get, you know, like 100 kids a year for those academies, where I'm allowed to nominate 10 per academy. And, you know, 4, 5, 6 of them get in. But I love talking to their parents and saying, you know, hey, beautiful education at West Point for free. Not only that, they pay you for 4 years. So how do we expand models like that? There's a really interesting law professor at NYU named Barry Friedman who says we should set one up for first responders, a first responder university, and pay them to go because and rethink our policing model, because so many things that police respond to have nothing to do with crime. They have to do with a mental health thing, or a cat in a tree, or a traffic accident, or something where a trained first responder is a much better choice than someone who has to come in with a gun.
Well, let me just sort of give you a thought. As you say, one of the other great advantages of being a member of Congress is you get to introduce legislation, and the rest of us just have to sort of send you letters and knock on your door and things like that.
Yeah.
I think
we get to introduce it and then wait 20 years for somebody.
Well, that's got to start somewhere, as you know. But it seems to me that as we have come through this pandemic, if we've understood nothing else, it is the value of people who perhaps we took for granted for an awfully long time in our society. And it seems to me that right now, to offer people a either greatly reduced college cost to pursue those careers might have a lot of bipartisan support. I don't know. It seems to me that, police and firemen are, and teachers and nurses and frankly, a lot of people that had factory jobs that they just had to show up every day because otherwise we wouldn't have food. I don't know how you put something like this together. It seems to me that we need to broaden the value that we've always placed on people who go to medical school, maybe go to law school, maybe they're engineers, or maybe they're science men and women, but these other people really have kept us from falling apart.
I wanted to jump in here real quick because we did have a comment from an audience member about what you're talking about. She had earlier, before we brought it up, mentioned student loan forgiveness for nursing students, especially given the fact that there's a nursing shortage right now. And I think it hits to the point of folks who are trying to serve their community and better their community with their role in society. So I'm curious what you think about that. And I'm sure this audience member would like to hear what you think about the reality of student loan forgiveness for some of those other roles that Allan mentioned, but nurses specifically.
I think it's a wonderful idea. Yes, absolutely. Anything that we're short of in society, and Virginia's relatively densely populated compared to some places, and yet we have huge swaths of place where there are no doctors, no midwives, no nurses. Yeah, it'd be wonderful.
Maybe what we should do, Don, is, or you should try and sort of say, you just said you get to nominate 10 people for each of the service academies, you and each member. Maybe you ought to be able to nominate 10 people to get, free tuition if they pursue, or their tuition paid off if they become a nurse, a midwife, or firefighter. Of course, that'll get you into trouble with the constituents that you don't, but it just strikes me as something that maybe would work.
That's the fun about being in politics, is you're always in trouble.
I know.
So there's another interesting way to look at this too. Allison, one of the great, and folks that are listening, one of the great privileges of getting to serve your country overseas is you get to go live in a different culture and see how they do things. So in Switzerland, at age 13 or 14, about 70% of the kids are channeled into career technical education. So they go learn to be a nurse or an auto mechanic or a pharmacist assistant or this or that. And they spend from 13 to 19, half class time and half working in professional skilled jobs. And so they're not college bound. Some 10% of them go to college anyway. And so unemployment's always 1%. Minimum wage is $48,000 a year. Everyone gets a job. There are more jobs than there are people. And conversely, then, the cost of a higher education to go to the University of Zurich is $1,000 a year. And when I see these kids, I say, why don't you come back and go to University of Missouri or go to University of Virginia? They say, why would I do that? It's $1,000 a year here to get a beautiful education. Because they just structured their whole system in a different way that maximizes employment and maximizes income. And the people that really need to get a law degree, get the law degree.
Yeah, no, and I think different cultures work differently. Portugal had a similar situation, although they not in terms of the early training that you have in Switzerland. But I think that we live in such our society in America is so much more heterogeneous than it is in the European countries that are old and much more homogeneous. I think that the question is, where can we go down the road in terms of, or do you see anything in terms of these major pieces of legislation we talked about a little earlier that can somehow deal with what I would call and it's been referred to, I think, by the speaker and others, the human infrastructure bills. I mean, how does students not become part of the human infrastructure, and since they're the future of the country?
Yeah, well, as I look ahead to the American Family Plan, which is the second half of the Biden infrastructure piece, it doesn't ignore college kids, but the focus has really been on children, on the kids that are living in poverty, and even the adults that are living in poverty. So the huge expansion in the child tax credit, which is going to lift half of the children in America living in poverty right now out of poverty. One fell swoop. It's one of those silver bullets. Right. And the huge improvement in the earned income tax credit for single people, for couples that don't have children, again, is going to be an enormous difference. But I think they're more likely to nibble around the edges is probably an understatement, because if Joe Biden does forgive $10,000 per student, that's not just nibbling. That is very real money. When the average student loan debt undergraduate is $28,000, it's almost, it's more than a third of it. Right. But I don't see this year's bills doing the kind of structural, hey, higher education is free.
Okay, so let me just add this point. So if I hear what you're saying, you think that Biden will probably, by executive order, reduce $10,000. I know you're not saying that's going to happen,
but it was a campaign pledge. So I do think that he's trying to prepare to do it. I do think timing is everything in politics. So he's not going to let that interfere with the big infrastructure plan, the American Family Plan, the American Jobs Act. But so I don't know timing, but my instinct would be in the fall of this year. Certainly before the 2022 elections.
Right, but my other thought would be this: is that when you just described the American Family Plan and where the real focus needs to be, I think that I would sort of say, wouldn't it be good if we could figure out a way that as we're trying to bring these people out of poverty, that they are not going to walk into the same trap that all these other kids walk into in terms of student debt?
Yeah. Well, let me just throw two more ideas at you guys, because you're so nice and you haven't yelled at me yet. One is the Honorable Tim Kaine, who was raised in Kansas City, Missouri, right. University of Missouri graduate, Harvard Law School, one of my favorite people on the planet. When he was governor, his opening message was free universal preschool for 4-year-olds. Right. And he only really got it for those in need, which is still a huge advantage. Because if we don't get these kids while they're early, the 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, they're not going to be ready to go to college anyway. They're just not going to be college capable. That wonderful, my favorite statistic of the year 2014 was that our children, my children, your children, Allison's children someday will hear 30 million more words by age 5 than a child living in poverty.
Right.
That's a big difference. Tim had even said, if you took K through 12 and moved it down to pre-K through 11, it would cost the same amount of money, the same facilities, the same teachers, and yet the outcome on society would be dramatically different. The other piece is we deal with the worst income inequality in America in 100 years and the worst wealth inequality too. So your average Black family has 1/8 the net worth of the average white family, among many other statistics. There's legislation out there right now, Cory Booker in the Senate, I think Richie Neal in the House, who's chairman of Ways and Means, on baby bonds, where every child born in America gets $1,000 at birth in a fund that he or she can't touch. And then it's added to every year based on the family's net worth. So my family, rich car dealer family, blah, 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 they get nothing. But a poor family that's living, you know, in a rural community in southeastern Missouri or inner city Kansas City is going to have, you know, $25,000 contributed over the course of their first 20 years, which may have grown to $75,000 based on what the markets do. And that can then only be spent on their education or to start a business or to buy that first home, you know, not on a new Corvette. These things are really carefully structured, and it's a long-term way. And by the way, the cool part is it's colorblind. It doesn't care whether you're a poor white person, a poor Asian American person, a poor Black person. You know, it's families that have been left out. That gives people a chance. And of course, once they get it, it's not enough to make them. They still have to work all their lives, but they have a head start. The kind of head start that my kids had.
Allison?
I have a question for you from the audience. It's a more philosophical question related to why is education always spoke about in terms of labor? Is labor the only value of a good education?
No, that's a wonderful question. No, I think education for me is about realizing our humanity, which is why a lifetime of education is so critically important, that we are constantly exposing ourselves to new things and reading and trying to find the answers. And one of my favorite ideas, Barbara Tuchman, who won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one for The Guns of August about the first couple of weeks of World War I. She wrote a book called A Distant Mirror, The History of the Calamitous 14th Century. I recommend it to you if you have 3 extra months on your hands. And it was, this was the century that had the 30-year war between England and France, and the schism in the church when you had 2 popes, and the Great Plague that killed half of Europe. And she says, if you go back to 1300, everyone's living in dirt floors, and the average lifespan hit 19 at one point in that century. And what the difference is between then and today is nothing except applied information. Education is the only difference, what we've learned and what we've applied. Dramatically different. And so that's, for me, I always figure with my kids, we give you unconditional love and the best education we can afford. And then you're on your own. Get out of my way.
Yeah. It was kind of, we gave our kids the same message. I think that, but again, our kids were fortunate like yours, where they left college with no student debt.
Yeah.
And at the time, and like you, it cost my father $1,000 a year for room, board, and tuition when I went to the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And even though, he didn't make very much money, he could afford that. He could afford. And so it was a whole different time. And now I think the question really is, how do we help these kids get out of the situation that they're in? Other than if the president does something, I think that's great. Do we need to modify any of the rules that we've got out there now? People who, as I recall, if you want to get your loan forgiven, you got to work 10 consecutive years in the public sector. And if you take a break because you get sick or something, you got to start all over again before that works. Are there ways to kind of clean that up and make it easier for students, you think?
I'm sure there are, Alan, and I don't know all the details of it, but certainly the ability to refinance the loans at competitive market rates, a genuine sense of fairness and charity and how the regulations work. And the $10,000 would help. And then thinking long-term about how this does. And by the way, if you start to index it, I saw some great charts this afternoon getting ready for a conversation with Allison about how the student debt is titrated by family wealth. And interestingly, kids from richer families borrow more money because they can, because they feel secure. Their mom and dad got great credit ratings and the like. So we need to make sure that we're addressing the people that need it the most, who really are, who their prospects for a full adulthood are really being hampered by this debt.
The immediate, $10,000, while we've agreed here that it can be helpful, I appreciate what you both said about, the privilege. We were kind of poking around the idea that there's a privilege associated with a good education. And I also want to point to, the different experiences of college students, and that a working college student has a much different experience than a student who doesn't work while they go to school. I know, for instance, I was just hanging by the seat of my pants sometimes trying to get an assignment in after a late shift, and knowing that I didn't fully grasp the topics. Maybe I did for the assignment, but not fully doing it. And so I think there's not only, this camp of people who we just want them to be able to arrive and get there to the same, type of education. And then there's those of us that maybe our parents can help us pay for it, or, we've been fortunate enough to grow up in a way that allows us to go to a prestigious school. I think there's just a wide sweeping, spectrum of students and the kinds of lives that they're living to get to that point of education, that point of career. And it depends on where you're coming in, where you might have opinions on how to address this problem. And one thing I wanted to ask you as we kind of get towards the end here is related to a lot of my work here at APS. In our student initiative, we're seeking to empower student voice and build agency in students, through our civics education. And we had a question earlier about, it was kind of vague, when will we ever prioritize education in the US? But it made me think about our civics education, starting from a younger age. We talked about preschool earlier, but we haven't really talked about that median group of how we're preparing students to make these big decisions about student loans and what we're doing in that group. I'd like to hear any of your thoughts about strengthening civics education in our country.
Oh, and just strengthening education overall. One of the challenges, as you guys know, is that our system of education has always been based on local property taxes. And some state constitutions have tried to fix that, but that worked better when most people's wealth was in property, but now it's not. And so just rethinking about the way we fund education would make an enormous difference. Part two is how we pay teachers. One of my favorite things when I get young people around the table, the 22 to 28-year-old, and say, now, what do you want to be? And it goes, a doctor, a lawyer, ambassador, I want to run the American Public Square. But almost nobody raises their hand and says, I want to be a teacher. And I've lost a bunch of the wonderful young people in my office over the last 6 years to law school and business school. None of them have gone off to be teachers. There's a wonderful book, maybe a little controversial, called The Smartest Kids in the World by Ashley something or other, Wall Street Journal reporter. And she spent a couple of years looking at the three countries with the highest PC scores, the international school. It was Finland, South Korea, and Poland. And what did they do? And the Finnish example I remember really well. It's harder to get into the 4 universities that allow you to be a teacher in Finland than it is to get into medical school in the United States. So they want only their best and brightest. And they also, I rarely quote Lee Iacocca, the former president of Ford and Chrysler, the head of the Mustang, right? He said, if we paid teachers what we pay lawyers and lawyers what we pay teachers, oh, what a different country we would have. And a bunch of other stuff. In Finland, they don't have school sports, which are a huge part of Friday night football in America. But instead, they study and learn, and they do club sports on the side. And there's a lot of stuff that we can do that make education a bigger deal. And on civics specifically, sadly, this is not an equal sign, but as we have focused ever more on STEM, which we need to do because they're all the engineering and cybersecurity jobs and stuff, we've sort of moved away from the civics education. And sadly, you really see that in Congress. The senators that don't know the 3 branches of government and things like that. So.
Right. Well, and really one of the things, one of the reasons we think American Public Square needs to continue doing what we're doing is because it is astonishing how little people have learned who didn't go to college, who didn't grow up when you and I grew up, Don. Which is not to sort of say the good old days were great, because there were a lot of things about the good old days that weren't so good. Yeah. But at least if you went to the schools that I went to in Missouri, you walked out and you understood civics, you understood how government worked. And today that seems to be sort of, that's sort of a 2-week light brush, and then they're on to something else. Yeah. And I think we're suffering as a result of it. As you said, I mean, when was the last time before we had senators that didn't know the 3 branches of government? It's not exactly an endorsement of anything.
My political Yoda, my mentor, taught a freshman English class at a university in Virginia that should go unnamed. And he had a quiz the first day that included questions like, who won World War II? How far is it to the moon? And what was the Civil War about? And others. And one year he called me up and said, Don, the closest answer I got on how far it was to the moon was 8 miles. That was the one that was closest. So,
no.
Anyway, so civics education would be very good. And I think when we saw that mess on January 6th, there was a whole lot of people that had no idea how our government is structured, how it works. And it's very sad.
No.
For those of you at home that are wondering how far the moon is from Earth, it's 238,900 miles. Exactly. I did not know. Right. In 8 comparatively.
And an easy way to remember that is it's 20,000 miles around the equator. So it's 12 times the equator to the moon.
Okay, I'm never going to forget that.
And
now.
We're going back to the moon. Maybe not 2024, but 2025, 2026. And we're going to go to Mars in 2033, women and men.
Yes, sir. We have really touched on a lot of different areas this evening, haven't we?
Yeah.
Well, so before we close here, Don, is there anything you'd like to sort of just address to this issue of students who are facing these issues, not just those who have the loans now and don't know how they're going to pay them off, but as they go forward into school and perhaps graduate school, what advice would you give them?
I don't know that I have any great advice about student debt, but in terms of education and studying and the like, my primary thing would be study what you love, because you can almost always, even if it's English, there's usually a way to monetize it if you're really excited about it and you love it. And the other advice I have is just read as much as you can, including reading fiction. There's now this growing body of evidence that people that read more fiction are much better human beings. They have more empathy, they have more understanding, they have more open mind, because they're constantly living in somebody else's head as you read this stuff. They know how other people suffer and how they experience joy. Gobble it up.
Well, thank you very much. Allison, you want to close?
Yes. Thank you so much, Congressman Beyer. It has been wonderful to talk with you this evening and to talk with Allan. To those of you in the audience, thank you for taking the time out of your evening to join us for our first Student Month program. We have 3 more this month. I hope you enjoyed the dialogue. I'd like to take a moment to point your attention to an email that you'll receive after the program with a link to a survey. We appreciate you taking the time to give feedback as it helps us plan for future programming at APS. We rely on the support of our members to have conversations like this. To those of you who are already APS members, thank you. And to those of you that are not members yet, I hope you'll consider joining us today. You can learn more about membership at our website at www.americanpublicsquare.org/membership. We hope that you'll also join us for, as I mentioned, our upcoming student programs as a part of Student Month at APS. This Thursday, a continuation of the same topics we've been talking about tonight, a signature panel discussion entitled Student Loan Debt, Where Do We Go From Here?, featuring panelists from different sides of the issue. And then on April 28th, we have a APS discussion group where you can talk with other community members in a facilitated dialogue about student debt. And then finally, our last program of Student Month will be on April 29th. You can join us for another APS signature panel discussion planned and executed by high school students from Paseo Academy of Fine and Performing Arts, Crossroads Preparatory Academy, and the Barstow School. find details for all of these programs once again at our website at americapublicsquare.org. Thank you again to those of you joining us, especially to Congressman Byers for joining us tonight. I hope you all have a great evening and a safe and healthy spring.
Thank you, Don, very much.
Thanks, Allan.
See you.
Thank you, Allison.
Thank
you.
Good job.